Hello, hello, hello. Oh boy, am I excited. The Docker extensions are out. Oh, we've been working on the Meshery extension for Docker for some time now, and Nick has been giving us lots of feedback. My name is Lee Calcote. I'm the founder of Layer 5.
Oh, and I'm Nick Jackson. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp and a fairly long-term Docker user. So for me as a kind of a developer, what I was enabled to do with Docker for Mac was I could do things like run MySQL containers. I could run Postgres databases. And I could run them really easily, really quickly, and I could do it in a kind of a disposable way. I didn't need to kind of pollute my local environment. And this was like a really big thing for me. I kind of like found this intriguing very early on, and being able to then sort of extend that and keep that sort of clean room environment as I kind of extended it out at testing was super useful. And then of course now we're kind of moving over to Kubernetes. Docker again delivered and gave me a way that I could run Kubernetes in my local environment. And of course we're moving one stage further still, and we're kind of starting to look at service mesh, which is running on top of Kubernetes, and kind of being able to do all of those things with smart networking. And I'm pretty excited about the new extension that you've got around with Meshery, which is kind of going to bring those capabilities for me too.
I'm right there with you, Nick. Actually, Docker Desktop has been a staple of my daily routine for about as long as I can remember. I think it was at DockerCon EU. It might have been Copenhagen when the integration with Kubernetes first came out. And I've been a fan ever since. It's just been really exciting to develop an extension for Meshery that now brings that same experience for service mesh in the same way in which Docker has brought that bundled experience for Kubernetes. What's been pretty neat also is that people are able to take, just like you have with some of the apps that you've been working with, is to take your Compose apps, get them over to Kubernetes, get them onboarded onto a service mesh, and do some experimentation, do some deployments, maybe even do some learning about the capabilities of a mesh that developers may or may not be familiar with.
Right, and like, you know, I've been using Docker Compose for I think as long as there's been Docker Compose, and I'm pretty still clued up. I still pretty think today that like there's no easier way to create a sort of a simple multi-tier application, just specifically in sort of the development environment. And when it comes to service mesh, like, should developers care about service mesh? Like, do they have to care about it? I think the answer is yes. And I think that's because you need to think about what I think is like kind of three key things, which is that the way you implement reliability patterns is changing. You're kind of no longer codifying them into your application. It's now externalized in the service mesh. And you need to kind of like learn service mesh and kind of understand how it works as a platform component. Being able to kind of have a tight feedback loop for developing and deploying workloads on console service mesh or other service meshes is really important. And we need a great developer experience. Like, the key thing is that we need to be able to have that developer experience, to be able to run locally, potentially disconnected, that we're kind of used to. So onto like the kind of the reliability, just kind of digging into that a little bit deeper. This is how I used to do things. So if I was writing something with, say, with Spring, I would kind of codify my reliability inside of my application. So I'm kind of like saying that, hey, this particular method is retriable, and like, you know, this is using SQL exceptions and things like that based on the retries, and that isn't necessarily going to be the case anymore. You know, you can think about externalizing that into the service mesh, and you can do that not just with RESTful APIs, but, you know, with database connections and all sorts of things as well, because service mesh really understands a lot of those application protocols. And then when you start to think about that, like, developer experience and that learning and why you need to kind of develop against service mesh, well, you know, there's a lot of really sophisticated capabilities that service mesh brings, such as a lot of automation around things like canary deployments. And that's kind of working in a slightly different way than what we're used to. And to be able to effectively sort of leverage those, you need to really sort of understand them and on a functional level. I think observability is one of the real big things that Service Mesh brings, and there's a multitude of metrics that's emitted from the sort of the capability that all your network traffic is flowing between these sidecars, and understanding what they are, which metrics are important to you, and kind of being able to leverage those again is a really important learning capability. And then I think you've got to think about the zero trust environment that the Service Mesh gives. So you can't sort of take for granted that a network connection is going to be available. Like you could sort of think about externalized connections and zero trust. Well, I might not be able to make a call to, like, I don't know, Google or something like that. You know, that external network connection in a zero trust environment is potentially not there. It's enabled by configuration. So being able to kind of test my applications and being able to kind of, you know, just play around with things before I have to push them into a larger environment really helps with that fast feedback loop. And then there's performance testing and behavioral benchmarking. I mean, you know, this is one of the kind of the staples of Meshery, the ability that I can kind of run performance tests against my application, the fact that I can kind of run these behavioral benchmarks. What happens if this particular service fails? Does my sort of configuration around reliability work correctly? And then helping me to kind of run some diagnostics when I need to. All of those things are really, really important. But, you know, I could talk about those things all day, but maybe it's just better if I just show you how it works.
Meshery's UI, we see console has been deployed and discovered. That operation was performed by the Meshery adapter for console, which is joined by a few other Service Mesh adapters. In this particular environment, we're connected to a Docker desktop, and that means that we're in a single Kubernetes cluster deployment. Meshery is a multi-Kubernetes cluster manager. We can go over and from here further configure console, but actually what's more interesting is taking a look at the application that we've just imported, our two-tier Compose app, and confirming that in fact it's been imported as a Meshery app. Our API and website, web tier been imported. We can deploy that application now, but what's actually more interesting is to go over and work on design and further explore the capabilities of the console service mesh. So inside this designer, we're able to go choose our console service mesh, the version that we want to work with, and then begin to browse the various functionalities and learn about how to apply these to our application, which gets built out dynamically here. Once done, you can save your updates. You can then deploy your designs. Even more intriguing though is the ability to use MeshMap as a visual designer for visually creating your deployments and further exploring the capabilities of each mesh of console service mesh. Again, here's our hash policies, and so we can use this UI to build these out. As we do, I'm going to take a moment to build on our design that we've just created, our console two-tier service. I'll get this loaded up, and I'm going to add a few things. So I've taken a moment to add in some additional configuration from our console service mesh. For example, that of splitting traffic across our subsets, assigning weights, defining some intentions that we might want in terms of how it is that we want our traffic directed, how it is that we want our terminating gateway to behave. And laying all of this out visually really helps the developer circumnavigate the configurations. They can choose to save them and recall them, organize them, a bit differently. So here I've taken a moment to configure a few capabilities of console service mesh, like that of service splitting. Maybe I want to adjust the weight between the subset and how traffic is being split between the two web deployments that we have. And so traffic then can be, we can use service intentions to make sure that we're filtering in the right way, sending traffic out the right terminating gateway, and configuring how it is behaving. So developers have this environment in which they can quickly iterate, save as different designs, or try new ones. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. And while that's deploying, I'm going to move over environment and grab some additional detail about the state of the systems that have been deployed and what's going on with them. So we can filter on our namespaces and take a look at our API and web deploy that we've just made. You can see we've got a pod. This pod probably has some metrics, things like network in and out. Can better understand how the service mesh is controlling our particular app. We could even establish like a terminal session or logging session with them to the extent that we might need to go in and debug and understand what's going on in these environments to better run the app.
One of the last points I had on that slide earlier on was about developer experience. And one of the things that I've loved with working with Docker over the last eight or so years is that developer experience. It just makes it really easy that I can just get out my laptop and I can just go do my job. And I think now with Docker extensions and the Meshery extension to be able to deliver service mesh into that environment, I kind of continue that trend. I can kind of just write my code without having to worry about my development environment.
More than that, I'm impressed by how much you are able to do without leaving Docker Desktop. That's really something. The extensions are pretty interesting. The Meshery extension is now available for everyone else. It's time to go out and try the Meshery extension, deploy a console mesh, learn something new. I know I did in watching Nick and some of the configurations of console. Nick, thanks so much for being an early user of the extension and for sharing your story today with everyone at DockerCon.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, honestly, anytime.